Okay, good. First, I wanted to introduce myself and our VP of Accounts. My name is Steve Salpst. I'm the CEO and co-owner of a company called HealthSense Inc. We work with a number of large urology practices, many of whom are LUGPA members, and we provide a number of different services. We provide consulting services for payer contracting, we do credentialing, we do marketing, we even help with social media strategies and those kinds of capabilities. So it's a pleasure to be here. Been here at LUGPA before speaking on specific topics such as reimbursement analysis and payer contracting. So I won't belabor too much on that. I just wanted you to at least orient a little bit to who we were and what we do. So I'll let you read that later. Relative to this session, I thought it would be interesting prior to the session to do a little bit of surveying. So we went ahead and surveyed the membership attending, and what I thought was interesting, we asked the question of which best describes the M&A activity within your practice, and we found that essentially all of those that responded didn't have any additional plans at this point for new mergers, or said they'd already merged. So basically, kind of tells us that you've gone through this process of merger, or you already established yourself as a large entity, at least based on the small sample size that responded. Now this one, I think is very revealing relative to some of the challenges that are associated with mergers. So we picked a few associated topics, and the one that came out most prominently relative to challenges, and this really goes back to the point that Pat made about culture, is how do you share the upside relative to compensation? And I'm going to give you a real practical example that I've actually dealt with real time with a recently merged practice that makes this a big challenge. But clearly it's on the minds of the membership here relative to how you go about doing compensation sharing, and I believe that really does tie back in to the previous cultures of the individual practices that merged into the single tax ID. A couple of points of background about mergers is that it's interesting to note that the dollars associated with mergers have increased and continue to increase rapidly, yet the number of mergers, the absolute raw number, has gone down. And this is definitely suggesting a trend that I think we're all aware of relative to the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, is we're seeing an acceleration of the merger activity, a larger number of practices basically coming together as a result. This certainly poses the challenge of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts relative to the fact that, again, when the culture comes together, it becomes very critical to have the business processes in place to operate as a single larger entity versus some of the prior business processes that may have been followed by the individual practices. So today I'm just going to share with you in the short time that we have together what I believe are a few practical business considerations relative to mergers that I think you'll find helpful as you start to think through your current practices or perhaps some of your future plans. Okay, so Pat covered this, I think, very nicely, but just quick review. Lots of reasons to merge, ranging from cost efficiencies, clinical efficiencies, perhaps bonus pool sharing, and not the least of which is assessing the cultural compatibility. Unfortunately, that may be the one area that is often not considered, that rears its ugly head after the fact, and we'll talk about how that can happen in a practical reimbursement situation. Now, Pat, didn't go into too much because it is a very extensive topic, into the notion of antitrust. But let me just tell you for a moment that I personally got involved tangentially in an antitrust investigation by the FTC on a large practice, and it had nothing to do with our business practices whatsoever, but it had to do with the way that the merger came about. And Pat talked about the fact that potential monopolistic behavior can be looked at and interrogated, etc. And I actually spent my morning and probably a week before preparing for discussion with the FTC, and a lot of the kinds of questions related to data sharing, okay, and what they were focused on and really trying to understand from the perspective of contract negotiations is what was the business process that was followed by that practice relative to the sharing of data of the individual entities before they came together under a single tax ID. And towards that end, essentially what needs to happen in this regard is you need to have what we call a super messenger, okay? And the super messenger is essentially could be a combination of a legal representative and a business/financial representative who is going to act as an independent party before you have the merging of the three entities under single tax ID, to essentially obtain copies of the various commercial and perhaps Medicare Advantage fee schedules, digest those fee schedules, and analyze those fee schedules to help make specific recommendations so that when the merged practice comes together, there is a clear and consolidated contracting negotiation strategy in place. Where there is a potential hazard here is if you begin to share information when you still operate as separate entities, separate tax IDs, and you start saying, let me compare my Blues and UHC agreements. Let's take a look at E&M codes. Let's take a look at surgical codes. Let's take a look at how our cystoscopy reimbursement looks out on 52,000. Let's take a look at our ancillaries, our 77418 IMRT. Let's see how we're doing there. And we start comparing that data at the level of each individual commercial payer agreement. Boy, that can be really hazardous, because then you get back to this whole notion of potentially the Clayton antitrust, Sherman antitrust, general antitrust considerations, because that can be construed as some sort of collusion between practices who are trying to exert undue influence on a payers. As crazy as that may seem, even two small practices that do that can really be at a hazard. And that's a good tip in general, that if you're competing friends or colleagues or in the urology, and they have a urology practice, you don't want to be sharing specific details about payer agreements and then have that become visible to a commercial payer. That can really cause you a lot of headaches. So the idea of the super messenger is to be able to consume that information for you, keep it confidential in the appropriate ways, apply the business practices that are needed, and then eventually when you become a merged entity, here entity D, practice D, at that point, of course, you can do that reconciliation. Or if you end up merging and you still carry forward some of those old payer fee schedules, we'll talk about how you can go about doing that optimization or maximization of reimbursement after the fact. Okay, so let's talk about a specific example here. And what this is about, this example essentially takes a look at three practices that are coming together into a merged entity. And for the purpose of illustration, I realize typical urology practices, you typically have 80 to 90% of your reimbursement tied up in probably somewhere around 25 or 30 codes, not 3. But the 3 will give us enough information here to make the point. And the point being that what is likely to be the situation is that you don't have uniform fee schedules for a single commercial payer agreement. So if that were the case, and this is a single commercial agreement, you have 3 different practices here that are essentially in a completely different reimbursement scenario. So we have a total, when we look at this as a combined entity, of 807K of revenue, a combined weighted average reimbursement, which very simply is the sum of the revenue based on contracted rates divided by the sum of the revenue based on Medicare rates. We have a combined weighted average of about 101%, but we can see there's considerable variance across the 3 practices that are coming together based on this code reimbursement. Now we can very much see that practice 2 certainly has the better overall collective reimbursement situation. So one of the things right off the bat that we might want to consider in this kind of scenario as we have merged is whether or not there's a legitimate way from a legal perspective to essentially write to the payers and ask the payers to take the contracts, or in this case, let's say it's a single contract, and assign it to the new entity, and maybe have the new entity, if it's, if it works out this way, again, you have to consider all of the legal considerations as well. But if you can make that new entity Practice 2, Practice 2 already has the best contract in place. So if that were the case across the board on business practices, payer contracts, etc., you might be able to not have to do a whole lot of negotiation and instead write to the payers and ask the payers to move have Practice 3 and Practice 1, write to the payers and ask them to simply move the payer contracts and reassign them to the new tax ID of Practice 2. Now, for a whole variety of reasons, that may not be practical. So if you then find yourself in the more common situation, which is you need to negotiate new agreements for this merged entity, how do you go about doing it is the question. And how do you maximize the reimbursement? Well, towards that end, I'll give you a real life example. But basically, if we consider the fact that we have two, let's say in this case, two practices coming together, all right? One of them is making $1 million on this particular PPO agreement for a 1-year period. The other making 200K. However, the one that's making $1 million is at 100% of Medicare. The one that's making 200K, the smaller one, is making a lot more on a weighted average basis. Say it's 120% of Medicare. And at the end of the negotiation, let's say the outcome is the payer offers 108% of Medicare, which of course is above what Practice A came into it with, but far below Practice B. The first question is, should we take it? And I would assert to you that you should take it in this particular example, ignoring any other variables, but looking purely at compensation. And the reason you ought to take it is this, is if you consider that you go up 8% on $1 million, okay, you're going to go up $80,000. If you go down what amounts to 10% on the smaller agreement, you're going to lose, in that case, $20,000. So you're up 60K, all right? And that's the name of the game. We're trying to make more money for the merged practice. But now, Mr. or Ms. Culture raises his or her ugly head because the practice that's making 200K says, wait a second, what's happening here? Now, my reimbursement is going down 12% of Medicare, 10% total. I mean, how can I accept that? And my suggestion in that regard is that you consider simple and equitable methods of allocation. Okay, meaning, look, if you make if you get a scenario where you make another 100K or 60K or 80K or whatever the incremental amount is as the result of a reimbursement renegotiation for the combined entity, then surely, in the example we saw before, if you have one practice making 200K and another making $1 million, now we can say, let's take ratios. 200K divided by 1,000,002 is X, 1 million divided by 1,000,002 is Y. Let's take that incremental money and spread it out by those exact percentages so that everybody benefits. Now, of course, you go back to many of Pat's points, we have to have a whole compensation plan and bonus pool consideration, but the point is, if you cannot figure out a way to take that incremental money and distribute it equitably, then maybe that whole basis for the merger is in question, because it should be a positive thing. You should be able to take incremental money and maximize the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, because I will tell you, I have seen practices that after the fact they swear that their goal is to get more reimbursement on every single payer agreement, then the weakest link in the chain, then the practice that you know, basically they want to be able to get more reimbursement, actually the strongest link in the chain, which may be the smallest practice. So the point being that at the end of the day, that's likely not to happen, because most payers are going to do the kind of analysis where they're going to look at your collective reimbursement, they're going to weight it, and because you are a larger, more influential practice, you're likely to be able to get more than the individual practices, but the issue becomes you're likely to find certain practices that merged making less in terms, if you were to look at them in isolation, than they did prior to the merger. And that's where you really have to have the business processes in place, both to do that analysis to make sure that you're benefiting the overall revenue stream of the newly merged practice, and at the same time a method of allocation of money so that all of the constituents of the practice can benefit. So that whole bonus pool sharing, very critical. Okay, this is a whole topic unto itself, but I at least wanted to include it in the chart deck, and that is we essentially have a 10-step process, including completing negotiations. And one of the things when you embark on contract negotiations in a merged entity, or for that matter as an individual practice, both, you want to do this in a very structured way, because you have to remember the payers have very capable actuarial personnel that are looking at reimbursement and slicing and dicing it, and it may not, and it's typically not a mistake, if you will, that you see certain discrete patterns show up when you assess E&M codes as a group, or you assess radiology codes or labs, etc. So what you want to do is do that data analysis up front, get effective proposal letters in place, make the initial contact, and be ready to know where the weak spots are relative to that agreement, and be ready to iterate it. And then eventually, if you can't get agreement, you're going to potentially escalate a large agreement up the management chain. You don't want to take your negotiating capability away by doing that too soon. So you want to work your way up the rungs of the payer ladder, and then ultimately get the contract in place and make sure you do the monitoring, because the other aspect is most of these agreements have lesser bill charge language, where you get the lesser bill charge of the contracted rate, and you can find yourself potentially getting less reimbursement than what you negotiated, because your bill charge, for instance, is set below your contracted rate. So anyway, that's in a nutshell a 5-course session that we teach through the AUA about how to negotiate payer contracts, but that's the punchline. Operational language, I gave you a list here, and basically what I would point out is focus on claims. The first one, the use of non-par providers, that's become a sticking point in some of the large payer agreements in every state that we've seen, and that is in order to negotiate an agreement or get in network with some payers, they require the use of in-network labs, and I know there have been some legal challenges in states like New Jersey in that regard, but you see that quite a bit, so make sure you understand the terms around the use of non-par providers, retrospective review, claims, refunds, etc. Okay. Pat touched on bonus pools. One of the things that we have seen as a pattern at this point relative to the rollout of the ACA is that PPO contracts are becoming a bit of a hybrid. Still, 95% are pay for performance largely, but 5% potential upside can be associated with what's called value-based or performance-based contracting, typically broken into 3 specific areas: the efficiency, the qualitative, and the quantitative metrics. And within those categories, there are certain thresholds that need to be met. For instance, generic drug utilization, preferred drug utilization thresholds. And if you meet those, then you get the 2%. Best practices, e-prescribe might be another 2%. Your surveys, use of in-network referrals, another 1%. So the thing you want to use this as a tool in your negotiation. In other words, traditionally you think about your PPO, fee for service, and you add it up, you say that's how much money I'm going to make. Well, there's an opportunity here now to introduce value-based contracting by and large into these discussions as well. So at the end of the day, when you think about mergers and acquisitions, and you think about all the points that Pat brought up and that I brought up relative to legal and business considerations, number one, make sure you do this right. Get a legal counsel from the start, and if you don't have somebody on board that understands all of the intricacies of the business side, and your payer contracts and your reimbursement and your claims and your central business processes, get somebody to help you with that as well. Do it right. Make sure you have your data sharing, your business processes set up right so you don't get into trouble with entities like the FTC. And cultural, I don't know how many times that word has come out of collectively the two of our mouths here, but that becomes so critical. Make sure the goals and objectives are consistent, that you know exactly why you're doing this, and that really all the practices are on board with all of the aspects of running the practice, clinical and business and legal, when all is said and done. So that's pretty much in a nutshell what I wanted to share with you today. At this point, I'll pause for additional questions for me, for Pat, and I'll draw Regina into it appropriately as well. So I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions at this point.